Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here. It has been a labor of love. My name is Lisa Morrett Cole, and before we get started, let me ask you to turn off any cell phones. We are recording, so if you don't turn it off, at least put it on silent so we're not interrupting. Thank you. So good evening, and thank you for coming to hear about your Springfield native, my father, John Morrett. It's touching to see so many of you, and know there are more on Zoom, to hear about this remarkable story about a remarkable man. Thank you to those who have come from out of town, many from a long distance, out of respect and love for our family and my father. A lot of work and love has gone into this presentation, and I want to thank the Heritage Museum for all that they have done, and especially Natalie. I thank Natalie again because she has been the initiator of this. We were actually moving from California to Texas, and she called in the middle, and I was thrilled to reach out and obtain many of the documents and photos from this historic chapter of World War II in the Philippines. The museum offered our family this presentation, and I'm honored to be a part of it. A special thank you for Paul, who's our intrepid videographer who's worked with me to whittle down that longer oral history into a presentation you'll see tonight. This enhanced video and separately the full video of Dad's interview will be available on YouTube, as Natalie has said, after this evening. Another shout out and thank you to Paul Taylor, who's not here tonight, but who interviewed Dad and does the introduction in this original video taken in 2003, and he asked such thoughtful questions to tell the full story. To my local cousins who are all here, the McGregors, thank you for offering your home for the filming and for your generosity and support of our side of the family. We've always lived out of town and often far away, but when we have come to Columbus or Springfield, you've enveloped us in family love, support, and a lot of fun. I feel blessed for all the Morrett McGregor White clan as a proud American family that my father came from and that we're kin to. Lastly, to my husband, Rick Cole, and my sister, Sandy, who made the trek with me in love and support of this whole project. This evening, I will add a few comments intermittently to illuminate my personal vision of the story. The saga being presented here is an unusual one. There are so many stunning survival stories from World War II, yet my father's has always captured the interest of those who heard it from him or read his book, Soldier Priest. In my opinion, that is because of a couple things. Number one, his spiritual approach to life with an intractable moral code and willingness as a seminarian to go to war when he was encouraged to take a deferment multiple times. He rightfully overlapped his devotion to God and his country. He used his unfinished clerical training to help carry him and inspire others during their terrible plight of the prison camps. Number two, how this survival created a determined willingness to fight or stand up to challenges for the rest of his days. Whether in his career as an Episcopal priest and his administrative responsibilities, his view of other wars, or pastoral approach to problems, he was always engaged. Dad was willing to speak up and overcome many of life's battles. For me personally, throughout my life and problems, he inspired perseverance. As his daughter, I thought many times, if he made it through that, I can make it through this. I hope in seeing his story tonight that this notion will stay with you. Dad was a part of that greatest generation, and as the faith of our fathers gave them the courage and fortitude to go into battle as the nation called them to do, they ultimately changed the tide of the world at that time. Entering World War II with soldiers like my father was what contributed to the final success of overcoming the evil of a few bad actors around the world. Sounds a little bit like today, doesn't it? But again, Dad had a moral code I heard many times. It was, stand up for the hard right versus the easy wrong. This actually came from the Boy Scout prayer of his era. I believe this early lesson from such an influential influential organization gave him the fortitude to stand and speak out for the hard right, not only in the war, but throughout his life. Willingness does not always come easily in tenuous situations, but if his country was calling him to fight, he was willing to be called as his responsibility to our nation. It cost him dearly to accept this call, but he did it. I leave you at this juncture with that full Boy Scout prayer. It remains a poignant instruction that could be helpful in today's world. Oh God, give me clean hands, clean words, and clean thoughts. Help me to stand up for the hard right versus the easy wrong. Save me from habits that harm. Teach me to work as hard and play as fair in thy sight alone as though all the world saw me, and send me chances each day to do some good and grow more like Jesus Christ. Amen. With that, let us move on to the video.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Hello, I'm Thomas Taylor, a member of the Department of History at Wittenberg University. This is one of a series of taped conversations with Clark Countyans recalling their experiences during the Second World War. The Reverend John J. Morrett, a retired Episcopal priest who was decorated for bravery as an Army officer in the Pacific, talked with us at the home of his nephew during Thanksgiving weekend 2001. John was born in Springfield in 1916. As a young man, he was active in the Boy Scouts and at Christ Episcopal Church on East High Street. He graduated from Ohio State in 1939 and began studying for the ministry that same year. After the war, he continued his seminary studies, was ordained, and went on to a distinguished career in the church, serving 2 years in Shanghai, 21 years in Honolulu, and 11 years in Columbus, Ohio. John's first call was to the ministry, but in 1941 his studies were interrupted by another call to accept an officer's commission in the United States Army. He was among those stationed in the Philippines when the Japanese attacked U.S. forces on December 7, 1941. During the months that followed, the Japanese, under Admiral Yamamoto, launched an all-out offensive in the Pacific, believing that Japan's only chance against the much larger U.S. was to win and to win early. The British surrendered Singapore in February and in March surrendered Burma. In the Philippines, General MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, but undersupplied and outgunned, the Filipino and U.S. forces gradually lost ground, and John was among the 70,000 that surrendered to the Japanese in the spring. Japan had never signed the Geneva Convention that protects POWs. Japanese military culture did not respect the concept of surrender. And the Japanese military was unprepared to take responsibility for so many POWs so rapidly. After their initial capture, these U.S. and Filipino soldiers were moved northward in a desperate 60-mile march that came to be known as the Bataan Death March. Of the 12,000 U.S. servicemen, 600 to 700 died, and at least 10 times that many Filipino soldiers died as well. Thousands more died in camp after the march, many of diseases related to malnutrition. Others simply were murdered by their captors. And that was only the beginning. Around 5,000 U.S. servicemen would die in Japanese POW camps before the end of the war. Second Lieutenant John Morrett survived the Battle of Bataan and the Bataan Death March to spend over 2 years in 4 different POW camps. In those camps, his 2 callings, as a soldier and as a priest, became one calling, and John learned to see Japanese men as both enemies and as potential friends. In September 1944, John was aboard the Shinyo Maru, a Japanese ship loaded with 750 U.S. servicemen. That ship was torpedoed, and over 660 of those POWs lost their lives. John and 81 others survived, were protected by guerrilla forces, and eventually were rescued by the U.S. Navy. John himself was decorated for his work that day, and he spent Christmas of 1944 at home with his family in Springfield.
Dean Angus Dunn, in the middle of my second year, called me to his office and said to me, "I hear that you have a commission in the military." And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you know, you're halfway through your training. Don't you think it'd be a good idea to resign, since there's so much war going on in the world?" And I said, "No, I didn't think so." And he said, "Well, would you be willing to ask for a deferment?" And I said, "Well, I'd be willing to write to the Dayton Military Headquarters for reserve officers and see if they wouldn't allow for a deferment," which I did do. And within a week, I got an answer to my letter, which simply stated that I was half through training for the ministry and I'd like a deferment. The reply was, no deferments are being granted at this time. So I accepted that. And on a little trip to a mission with a friend of mine, Charles Braidwood, one Sunday evening, we were discussing this, and he happened to be a pacifist. And he said, "Well, I've got some contacts in Washington, and I can see that you'll not be called." And I said, "No, don't do that. I mean, I accepted the commission, and I'm willing to fight for my country if necessary." So anyhow, I finished the second year in June, and Braidwood, soon after I got home, wrote me a letter and said he'd made arrangements for me not to be called. And this distressed me very much, and I also received, in about the same mailing, a letter from Fort Hays, Columbus, Ohio, asking for reserve officers to volunteer to go to Hawaii, the Philippine Islands, Alaska, and the Panama Canal Zone. And I said to myself, well, I'll let them know I'm available. So I checked the little box for the Hawaiian Islands and sent the reply letter right away to Fort Hays, Columbus. And within several days, I had a telegram there at home stating that I was to report for active duty at Fort Hays with, I think, the following Monday, which I did do, and so I was into it. Well, at first, I was a supply officer for Battery C, the 88th Field Artillery. And then that changed. We had, at that time, every battery had 4 officers, but one after another were taken away, and it left me as an executive officer and a CO for the battery. My battery commander was bumped up to the headquarters battery, and another officer was sent with the Philippine Army. So it left us with just the 2 officers in the battery. As soon as we arrived, all the military dependents in June of 41 had been sent home, which was an indication that the War Department was fearful that something was going to happen. And there was a good deal of talk about an invasion from Japan. And within a month's time, we had orders to be in the field with our trucks and guns. Every day of the week, and on Saturdays we cleaned the guns and repaired trucks. And we had Sunday off. And we also had orders that no one was to go to Manila for longer than just one day, and might be on a Sunday. So we were very much on the alert at that time. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang, and it was somebody from the communication shack saying that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and we were at war with Japan. So I immediately roused out the American MPs that were asleep, and said that they were to take over the posts that the Philippine scouts were manning around Stotsenburg. And then I went over to our battery headquarters, and at that point I was told that I was no longer with Battery C, but I was to develop an ammunition supply train for the battalion, because we didn't have any. Supply train provided the ammunition and the food supplies for the whole battalion. So they were commandeering trucks off the road and bringing them into a big truck park, and I went down there and began to organize for an ammunition supply train. I might say that that day when the war broke out at 12 noon, 2 flights of medium bombers came over and bombed Clark Field and simply absolutely destroyed Clark Field, which was adjacent to Fort Stotsenburg. But my main job was to get this going, and the military police were bringing in civilian trucks off the roads. So I lined up, I suppose, about 10 or 12 big trucks, and then the next day going over to the bodegas and loading them up with ammunition and supplies. And the next day, the whole battalion moved out and went north toward Tarlac, which is sort of north of Manila. And the war was on. I think there was a certain amount of orderliness and a certain amount of confusion. Orderliness in the sense that we had well-trained units. The scouts had been in the Army for quite a number of years, and they were, as I say, well-trained. But there was utter confusion, like the fact that we didn't have an ammunition supply train for the battalion, and had to pull all these trucks off the road and load up with ammunition and supplies and go north as quickly as possible. And with, again, the fact that the Japanese control the air, and they were over every day, bombing, strafing. And we were uncertain about exactly what to do. There had been 2 different war plans set up. One was to go into guerrilla warfare and disperse around the islands, and the other was to go into Bataan and set up a defense line there until help could come to us. But of course, as we know, it never came. So we were our gun batteries were firing within a week as the Japanese landed at Lingayen Gulf and began coming south through the center part of Luzon. Everybody was uncertain as to how things were, because we had a lot of Filipino constabulary and Philippine Army troops that were very untrained. Many of them had been just recently conscripted, and we were not sure how they were going to hold. And so we began to establish holding lines one after another. But the Japanese were seasoned troops and very aggressive, and there was a lot of combat going on and a lot of firing as far as our guns are concerned to keep them off our backs.
So my comments in this section I call the surrender. And at this juncture of the story, I want to inject a little about the dire situation that the troops found themselves in, being told to surrender. And he will go on to tell you. As Tom Taylor referred to in his opening comments, the parts of the Philippines had already been taken over by air and land by the Japanese, who had just bombed Pearl Harbor a few months earlier. I draw my comments from his book, Soldier Priest. This is now the first week in April 1942, and the troops had been holding the Japanese at bay since January, backing themselves into a corner called the Bataan Peninsula. Meanwhile, in their defense and retreat without promised reinforcements, inadequate food and ammunition created real problems. Dad, as an ammunition and supply officer, was scrounging everywhere. It was an ongoing pre-battle to keep things going, and the troop morale plummeted as the hope for American reinforcements faded into an acceptance they were on their own. They were abandoned for battles on other fronts in this World War. By this time, they were being strafed by the Japanese planes and bombed on the roads. The Japanese were moving in. In a touching comment, he wrote, and remember, he's only 25 years old, quote, "Amidst the turmoil, tears started trickling down my cheeks. I was wild with anger. Why did our struggle to fight off the invading Japanese have to end this way? I was determined to get the food to the gun batteries, even if it cost me my life." He did that, but now destroying their equipment was a new objective. The enemy was upon them. He tells, "It was demoralizing to say the least. They would surrender to a tiny country who did not agree to any international terms of treatment for prisoners. The Japanese would declare them captives with their cultural attitude towards our men as cowards for not fighting to the death. For my Christian father, this inhumane treatment of one man to another was shocking. Yet all the soldiers must have been shocked too, and scared without options but to comply. They were battered, shaken, exhausted, and starved. Dad's purposeful job of supplying the troops, and perhaps what kept him focused from sinking into the hopelessness that seduced so many others. Backed into a corner of Bataan, it was April 9th, a date he wrote he would never forget. The surrender was ordered at 12 noon by the battalion commander. They did not know whether they would be just outright slaughtered as the enemy rolled in their tanks. He and his fellow soldiers and the Philippine scouts were broken in spirit as they raised their white flags. They were asked to line up for a long walk to some unknown place. Dad writes in his book, "I had with me only one small bag and some extra clothing and my little pocket book of common prayer. The mixture of God and country had brought me to a surrender I could never have imagined." At the outset of the march, the Americans were both physically and mentally abused by the Japanese opponents. They felt free to steal any personal items of value. But as our guys would soon learn, all those things would pale by comparison to the precious gift of clean water to drink on this steamy, hot march. With so few food rations as well, it was hard to imagine a more frightening beginning to this wretched marathon. Dad would lose his canteen or substitute water carrier 3 times, making him especially vulnerable to death. He also lost his hat, leaving him with heat stroke from so much sun. After all that, it is my deep conviction he was saved, because God had a plan for him, and he was also aided by so many fellow soldiers several times. He had to dig deep, though, for survival. He will tell it from here, but please pay attention to the description of the Japanese Lieutenant Yuki and guard who remarkably helped them on a Christmas service in the camps. Lieutenant Kemper Yuki, a Christian, and Dad would later become lifelong friends and correspondents due to their shared Christian beliefs. It is a side story of two soldiers making peace between them that is emblematic of two nations that now are allied and have respect for one another. Triumph over tragedy and the gift of forgiveness that would mark his life. So let us continue.
Well, we didn't talk about that. We thought that reinforcements eventually would come. But of course, they didn't. And the concentration as far as American forces were down into Australia and over in the Far East, or over in the European theater, and the battle in North Africa. So there was a certain amount of real uncertainty. Well, there was a lot of talk. Are we going to, and rumors that we were going to have reinforcements, but they were just rumors. They just didn't come, and we were placed on half rations in January of '42, and we knew we had very limited supplies. As I tell in my story, sometimes we'd go out at night along the ocean and drop depth charges and a little dynamite and kill the fish, and we harvested the fish, and sometimes we'd be, as the lines pulled back, where there'd be rice fields that hadn't been harvested, and even at night the guys would go out and harvest the rice as best they could. And, so we began, and then of course we butchered all of our horses. We had 1,000 horses, and so we were eating horse meat when we could get it. And there was a lot of malaria, and it was so bad that we had to set up a little hospital within our battalion just to take care of the malaria patients. And men were getting weak; they were not eating enough, and so there was a big morale problem. I guess internally I was sort of in shock that we couldn't hold out and we couldn't get reinforcements. The bombing was just severe. Planes overhead all the time and bombs dropping around, it was... We just began a retreat down toward Marvelas, which is at the end of the island of Bataan, or Peninsula of Bataan. It was just a rout. The road just absolutely filled up with infantry and artillery forces, just jammed with men and guns and trucks. And I wouldn't say it was called a rout, but it was a steady withdrawal in toward Marvelas. And a great deal of uncertainty as to what was going to happen. We withdrew several places, and then finally we ended up at a place called Cab Cabin, which was the main area where we stored our ammunition, and had word that General King was going to surrender the next day, and that the bodegas are going to be blown up. So we got into a dugout, and then after dark they just blew up those bodegas, and a tremendous noise. And I was concerned as a supply officer about the firing batteries that were ahead of us. So the next morning I was able to get some Class C rations, and my truck went down with bombing around me. And got down to the front lines, or not front lines at that point. It was where our batteries were. and passed out the Class C rations. The guns were blown up. Rifles were taken apart and thrown all over the place, and engines and trucks were destroyed as best they could. And, it was papers were burned, money was burned, and then everything got quiet from about, I don't know, maybe 10 to 12. Everything, there was a complete stillness, a rather strange feeling. So quiet, and no firing going on at all. And then right on the dot of around 12 noon, these tanks began coming up the road with firing on both sides. And then after that, the first tank had gone past us. Second tank came up without any firing going on, and then there was a third tank that came up the road. And there was a Japanese standing in the open turret, and he had a pistol in his hand. He was motioning for everybody to go down the road. Well, I'd taken my .45 apart and thrown it all over the place. And then a fellow named Jimmy English said, "Johnny, you better have a rifle in your hand, and so to surrender with." So I went out on the road, but instead of surrendering my rifle, I threw it down the road. I was really mad. And then more and more of the Filipinos began to come out on the road, and we just started on the march. Well, the march is probably the most terrible experience I've ever had in my life. We started out following the direction of the Japanese soldiers or pointing down the road, and Filipinos waving their white surrender flags or white materials of one sort or another. And they collected us in an open area, probably 200, 250 men. And we slept on the ground all night. I snuck off and was able to get some Class C ration from some trucks that were parked there that belonged to the 200th Coast Artillery, and brought a bag of Class C rations back to our group. And then we began to walk through what we call the no man's land of where a lot of fighting was done. There was one body on the road that had been driven over by many trucks. It was flattened out. The stench was terrible. The smell of rotting bodies and gunpowder. And we walked through this terrible place and stopped again and slept on the ground all night. There was a stream where there were dead bodies, and men were getting their canteens full of water from that stream, which was a very questionable thing to do. As you walk down the road, there would be firing of stragglers being shot and beaten with long bamboo poles. Then we got to an artesian well and fill our canteens, and I got mine full, but then after I got it full, a Japanese came up to me and took it away from me, which made me very angry. And I started going for him, but then a couple of guys grabbed a hold of me and said, "Johnny, come on, can't do that. So I was without any water, and somebody gave me a bottle that had a little had quinine in it, and I got that full of water. But on the other hand, it wasn't long till it fell on the road and broke. So I was really desperate, and I guess I'd lost my little hat, that I'd thrown away my helmet and had a little campaign hat, and I somehow or other, I guess in my sleep, I'd forgotten about it, and so I didn't have any hat on. And we marched another day and came into another encampment, barbed wire around a area, maybe an acre or so, and the Japanese gave us some rice to eat that was pretty well scorched, nothing else but rice. And after another night, we started out again. It rained, and we walked all night. Rained during the night a little bit. And the next day, I became very faint, and I just didn't think I could carry on. And a Chaplain Howden, a friend of mine, and another Air Force lieutenant grabbed me by the armpits and dragged me. Again, as I say, as the end of the column began to come up, and I could see men are being shot and beaten. Why, I just had to walk. I just stiffened my legs and walked into the town of San Fernando and literally passed out when I got into the compound. The stench was terrible. Sometime during the night, it must have been Chaplain Howden came with a mess kit of a little bit of milk and bananas and fed me, and then I passed out again. And the next morning woke up and they began to get us into columns of 4 and groups of 50 and marched us to a little railroad station where we were jammed into boxcars, hardly room enough for anybody to do anything but stand, for some certainly, and took us up to a little town burial called Capas, C-A-P-A-S. And there in the town square were a large group of women gathered around. They had baskets of fruit on their heads wanting to give us fruit. And the guards wouldn't allow that. So they finally broke through and gave us fruit anyhow. And then the guards with the butts of their rifles drove them away. There was one little woman that got up to me, and I said, "I need water." And so after we were there for maybe a half an hour or so, a column was formed again, and the little woman ran up to me and had a old gin bottle with a piece of twine around the top and thrust it into my hand, and off I went. So that had to be my canteen for some time to come. We marched into O'Donnell, and we were all told to sit on the ground, and a Japanese captain stood on a box, and he shook his fist at us and said, "We hate you. You're not prisoners of war, you're captives. And you should have surrendered a long time before you did, and don't think you're going to be treated well because you're not," or something to that effect. And then we were assigned to barracks, and at that time I was really, I must have had a heat stroke, and I was just sick in my stomach every time I got out in the sun and wanted to vomit. And so some fellows brought me some food, and I began to feel a bit better and get up and get my own chow. which was boiled rice. We called it lugao, and it was always scorched and had a terrible taste to it. And then there would be some Philippine camotes mixed up in the lugao. And that was our food a couple times a day. And no bathing facilities. I don't think I took a bath for, 2 or 3 months, except out of a canteen of water. There were slit trenches in the back of the barracks where men were defecating because of the lugao and loose bowels. And the deaths began to occur, one after another. It was just as horrible a situation as you could possibly imagine. And there were at least 500 Filipinos dying a day and up to 60 to 80 Americans. There were something like over 20,000 Filipinos that died in the roughly 3 to 4 months that we were in that camp.
From the surrender on April 9th to your delivery to your first prisoner of war camp, how many days were you traveling? How long did that take?
I would say about 6 days.
6. Yeah, in history, starting with the press and later on historians, the U.S. surrender and the transit to prisoner of war camps came to be called the Bataan Death March.
Mm-hmm.
You guys wouldn't have called it that.
No.
Do you remember when you first heard that label for it?
Oh, sometime later, after the war was over.
After the war was over?
Yeah.
Not even in 45 or when the conflict was still going on. Young people growing up today, when they see movies about Americans or anybody in prisoner of war camps during World War II, see someone in a prisoner of war camp and stationed there for however long the war lasts or until that person escaped or died. Okay, how many different prisoner of war camps were you in?
I was in 4.
4. And how was that unusual compared to other men that you knew? That number of camps, moving around that often?
I would say practically everybody was in 2 to 3 camps or 4 camps. It just depended. Now you take a fellow who'd lost his legs, for instance, he might be in Bilibid the whole time, and that was in Manila.
Mm-hmm.
But we were moved around on work details, one place to another.
The physical conditions in your first camp, what was the name again?
O'Donnell.
O'Donnell, were awful, about as bad as they could get.
That's right.
What was and you and your friends, your colleagues, all these men, some of whom were close friends, many of whom you didn't know, of course, had just been through one of the worst experiences in American military history. What was the mood like?
Well, it was depression, certainly, is one word that would describe it, because we were hurt, shocked, uncertain about the future, what was going to happen. It was hard to imagine that our U.S. Army had been defeated by the Japanese. I think there was confusion in people's minds as to what's next, what's going to happen next. But I think the main thing was just a deep down hurt or depression that we'd lost our phase of the war, which was hard for us to imagine. The U.S. Army was defeated.
Did you think, well, we've lost the first phase, but they'll be back?
We hoped they'd be back, and I felt they'd come back. We didn't know when, of course, but we felt that in time, our forces would be able to recapture us and we'd get back. Now, as far as surviving the camp, I think some men simply gave up. I mean, they're alive today and gone tomorrow. I mean, they just didn't have any hope of survival. And I hate to say it, but I think there's some weak character in that, you know. I mean, I never felt I would give up. I got scared because when I got the trots, boy, that's the beginning of the end for most men. But fortunately, I had a good friend, Bill Miller, who got me some pill that seemed to stop it.
Fred Koenig wrote a poem about the men in Camp O'Donnell. Mm-hmm. Did you know Fred Koenig at the time?
I did not know him, but I was so impressed with that poem that I memorized it in prison camp.
In the prison camp itself?
Yeah.
They're at O'Donnell or at the next camp?
At O'Donnell.
Would you read that poem for us?
The unvanquished speak. Here on this sun-scorched hill we laid us down, in silence deep, as in the silence of defeat. Upon our wasted brow you placed no laurel crown, but neither did you sound the trumpet for retreat. Mourn not for us, for here defeat and victory are won. We can no longer feel humanity's insidious harm. The strife with famine, pain, and pestilence is done. Our compromise with death laid by that mortal storm. Though chastened, well we know our mission is not dead, nor are the dreams of victory we dreamed in vain. For lo, the dawn is in the east, the night is fled, before an august day which will be ours again. So rest we here, dear comrades, on this foreign hill. This alien clay, made somehow richer by our dust, provides us with a transitory couch until the loving hills of home enfold us in maternal trust. We are assured brave hearts across the sea will not forget the humble sacrifice we laid on freedom's sacred shrine, and we hold that righteousness will be triumphant yet, and o'er the earth again his star will shine.
Conditions were better in your second camp.
Yes.
How long were you there? Tell us about that camp.
Well, that Cabana de Juana was a facility that had better barracks than those at O'Donnell, which were mainly of straw and bamboo. The barracks in Cabana de Juana had cast iron roofs and well-made bamboo sides and wood flooring, while the other was just dirt flooring. It was a cleaner camp. We were all Americans. No Filipinos were around. The food was somewhat better. But still, the deaths went on, mainly from dysentery and malaria, and I would say by that time practically everybody, if not everybody, had malaria. And many had dysentery, and that was a seal of death. We were counted off in tens, so that if any one of the 10 escaped, why the other 9 would be shot, and that did happen. Not at our camp, but at another work camp nearby. So it was not an easy situation. Chaplain Howden had very bad beriberi, and he was close to death. And so when we heard that 1,000 men were to go down to southern island of Mindanao, why, he was one of the first on the list. Maybe we could save his life. And I was not on the list, but I traded with somebody else and got on the list so I could be near him. And we were shipped down to the island of Mindanao, which is the largest of the Philippine islands in the archipelago.
And what did you do there?
At the third camp of Cabana, the Davao Penal Colony, for the most part, we worked in the rice fields, growing rice for ourselves, and in the jungles where we cut down bahuka and made into rattan furniture. And there was a fruit orchard and some vegetable gardens, so we were working to feed ourselves and to make some money for the Japanese.
Where were you, let's see, Christmas 1942?
Christmas 42 was at the Davao Penal Colony. There was a Lieutenant Kempe Yuki, who was a kind Japanese, tried to help us, and was in command of the prisoners. He proposed that we have a Christmas Eve service, which would involve the Japanese, Filipinos, and the Americans. And it was held in the big dining hall, and there were various and sundry performances. And it worked out very well. And it did a lot to build up our morale.
You preached?
Well, I did preach that night at a little Episcopalian service. In back of the barracks, there was a wood shop in back of the barracks, and I asked Chaplain Albert Braun if it was all right if I'd hold an Episcopalian service, since I'd kept my little Episcopal prayer book from during the march out of Bataan and used it on a daily basis. So he agreed, and after the show was over, those Episcopalians who wanted to come were met there in the old wood shop. I guess there were about 25, 35, or 40 people that met. And I had a pretty typical Episcopalian service. Terrible sermon.
What was the text? Do you remember?
Oh, I don't remember.
Tell us about Lieutenant Yuki. This guy's an interesting character.
He is a most interesting character. Yuki appeared at Cabanatuan, and he spoke broken English, and he would talk to the prisoners at the fence. And the word got around that he'd been a Christian. I never did find out what denomination, but and maybe he was a Catholic. But he was in charge of that 1,000-man detail to go down to Davao. And he allowed us to be on the deck of this old freighter, the Erie Maru. When there were several deaths aboard, in one case, he took the corpse on shore and was buried at a cemetery. I think it was Ilo. And the second death, he had brought in some sailcloth, and the body was wrapped in that. And when the time came for the body to go overboard, he stood at attention with all of us and had a Japanese bugler who sounded off some kind of Japanese piece of music. I'm not sure what it was, of course. But he was very kind. And when we got out at a place called Tabunco, after getting onto Mindanao, he marched with us clear to the Davao Penal Colony, which was a march that took all day into the jungles. So I was impressed with him. And at Christmas time, we had this Christmas show event, and he was very pleasant in helping to put it together. I know he was able to get communion wine and wafers for the Catholic chaplain, Captain Albert Braun. And then a couple months after Christmas, some of the Americans said, Lieutenant Yuki, how about our going out to the vegetable gardens and the fruit orchards without guards? And he said, well, if you agree not to escape, I'll let you do that. So it was discussed and agreed that there would be no escape. Well, it wasn't very long after that 8 Americans and 2 Filipinos and 2 American enlisted men took off. And of course, Yuki lost his job as command of American prisoners.
Did they take off while in the orchard, or was that?
Yeah, they went out on that orchard detail, and then they took off from the orchard. And what it made it very bad is that they sent out several squads into the jungles to try to find them, and one of the guards was killed by the guerrillas that were moving around. That was bad. So those of us who were in the same barracks with those who had escaped were put into a disciplinary compound. And Major Morrett, who was in command of the whole camp, came into the compound, called us together, and dressed us down for the escape. Why didn't we prevent it? And then after he left, Yuki spoke to us, and he said that he was very sorry that the thing had happened, that he felt that we'd made an agreement not to escape if we could go to work in those 2 places without guards, but he would forgive us. Well, I was dumbfounded when he said that, and then he just quietly walked out. So believe it or not, 20 years later, when I was taking a trip around the world, I was in Japan, and I got somebody to advertise in Japanese and English papers that there was an American named John Morrett, captain, who was trying to find a Lieutenant Kempe Yuki who was kind to Americans during the war.
It's quite a story, isn't it? So my third commentary I call Standing Up. In this segment of comments, I just want to focus on one part of the story he will tell that speaks volumes to me about growing up here in Springfield. I'm hoping for you here tonight that it will remain with you as an inspiration from a hometown boy who lifted up other men by that Boy Scout tenet of standing up for the hard right versus the easy wrong. It was just one sentence, but one that would resound in the inner sanctum of his thinking, not just here as a captive, but for the rest of his life. There's a moment in his story that is particularly poignant and memorable. It occurs while in his 4th and last POW camp he calls detestable Lasang. 650 American POWs were moved in for labor to repair a damaged coral landing strip for Japanese military use. A fighter plane had gotten stuck in a pothole. The Americans were ordered to go in and push the plane free. Dad simply refused to go. Quoting again from his book, "Here we were, men who had fought on Bataan and Corregidor, ordered to push a plane free so it could attack our forces again. We had struggled so hard to defend ourselves, starved for weeks, made the Death March, gone through Camp O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, and Depakal, and now this." Tears came to my eyes, he said. I did not care if a guard shot me. I was not going to move towards that plane. God and country were so important in my life. Later that evening, all 650 men were called to assemble, only to be harangued by a particularly badgering Lieutenant Hoshida about their unwillingness to work. At the end of his tirade, Hoshida barked, "Will you work? You will work. You will work." And something just snapped. An electric charge went through him. He broke the line and mechanically started walking towards Lieutenant Hoshida all by himself. Quoting, "Directly in front of him, I saluted him and said, 'I am an officer and a soldier of the United States Army. I cannot work for you on this airfield.'" Then he heard Lieutenant Colonel Rogers' voice from the back of the assembly walking towards Hoshida saying, "What this officer has told you is the feeling of all of us. We do not want to work on this airfield, and we want you to send us back." Hoshida stepped off his box and walked away. It was a monumental moment, not just for my father, but for all those 650 men standing with him. This heroic protest that may have been born out of a breaking point in his morale and could have been fatal for some, if not all of them, was nonetheless a triumph in standing up for a hard right and a not so easy wrong. This is a confrontation I will never forget. It represents the best of this small town, Midwestern town, the best of the Boy Scouts, the best in our American valor and courage, and speaks volumes of our fathers and grandfathers in that greatest generation. A personal nod to my family heritage from Springfield, and I want to thank this all-American city for its values in making my father who he was. It is a gift to be here and share this story. And I'm just going to add, considering what has gone on this week, it is incredibly special for me to be able to say this. No matter how you feel, this city has gotten quite a rap this week. He will go on to tell you about his astonishing escape in the episode that drew on luck, perseverance, and a will to live. Let's continue now to the end.
And we got the word that 650 of us were to be sent to this combat field. And there was great opposition to that on the part of we Americans. And even to the point of saying we wouldn't go. But nevertheless, they brought in more troops and took us down to, from Davao, the third camp, to a place called Asang, which was a work camp and a Japanese airfield, where obviously there were combat planes on the field. Don't remember the exact numbers, but there were both bombers and fighters on that field. And we were taken down, put into a tight compound with 4 barracks and a mess shack. And then outside the fence, of course, there were quarters for the guards. And when we got down there, we were taken out to the airstrip, told to spread coral on the airstrip and dig drainage ditches along the airstrip, and we refused to work. And so they'd outline a certain area where we were to lay the coral or slice down some of the topsoil so that there'd be better drainage. And we just wouldn't work. And then there would be arguments, and they would cut down the areas of where we were to work, and still we wouldn't move on it. And this went on for a couple weeks, and the rainy season began, and we'd come in from the airstrip just drenched, and everybody had malaria and chills and fever, and it was just tough going. And then one day, a plane came in, and somehow or other one wheel got involved in a little hole, and the Japanese ordered the Americans to go out and push that plane out of this hole, that one wheel. And boy, I just wasn't going to go out there and do that. And but anyhow, the guy said, "Oh, come on, Johnny. Don't worry about it. Let's go ahead and do it." I wouldn't go. So I began to cry. This was the worst at trying to help the Japanese. And anyhow, it was a very deep emotional experience that I had at that point. And then that night, when we were all lined up, and Lieutenant Hoshida began to harangue us as usual about working. He said, "Will you work? You will work. You will work. You will work." Saying that again and again. Something inside of me just, I don't know, caused me to walk up to him. We were on 650 men all lined up. I walked up and I saluted him and I said, "Lieutenant Hoshida, we can't work on this field. You know this is a combat field. This is something we can't do." Well, poor old guy, he didn't know how to respond. And so he dismissed everybody. And that night, a group of enlisted men came in and says, "Johnny, we got to escape out of here. We just can't keep doing this." But on the other hand, I couldn't warm up to escaping, because if one man escaped, boy, it'd be hell broke loose on everybody else. I couldn't do that. So anyhow, with the rains, a group of enlisted men of 50 broke down and started working, and then another group started working, another group started working. So first thing you know, we were all doing a little bit of work, but not much.
So when did you get out of there?
Well, we were there on Lasang for, I guess, about 4 months. And then American planes began to come over and bomb the airfield at night. And it was obvious, the Americans were coming in. So we were told that we were to be prepared to leave on one morning. Well, that was delayed, and then that was delayed. And finally, I think it was the third morning, we were up about 4 a.m, and just at daybreak, while we were all lined up, and they had us tied in ropes to the man in front of us and the man to the rear of us. So we were all tied together, and then they brought in more troops, and they had trucks with machine guns on them, and so they could machine gun us down if there was an effort to escape. And we were taken down to a place called Tabunco, and a 100-man detail from Davao was brought in. They were also on an airstrip. And I don't know, never did know what exactly happened down there, but anyhow, there was a total of 750 of us were put on the Shinyo Maru, which was an old American freighter. And down in the hole we went, and we were jammed in there head to foot like sardines in a can. And everybody began to really sweat. And then the next day, we were still in the Gulf of Davao. An American plane came over, and I could see through the open hatch the insignia on the plane, and it dropped a bomb, but it missed us. Thank goodness. And then we started out going, we didn't know where, of course, but eventually we got to Zamboanga, and on 2 Sundays I was asked to preach, which is some challenge, but I got through it some way or other. And I just simply told the men, I said, God loves us, and no matter what happens, we got loved ones at home that are praying for us, and that if you believe in a good God, you're going to be all right. The chances are pretty slim of getting out of here, but nevertheless, we've got to have faith that God cares for our souls. Well, food, of course, was terrible, mainly a little bit of rice and a canteen cup of water. And we sure needed it because that hold was so hot. And we gradually made our way up the coastline of Zamboanga. And on the 19th day, when we were all crowded in there, there was this submarine paddle that hit us with 2 torpedoes. And while we were in this hole, there was a wooden partition that was just the rear back of me, and I thought, if something happens, I'm going to have to get through there. Well, with the explosion, the wooden partition blew away, and I climbed through the hole I was into the next hole and on a lot of baggage and got up on the deck. And here were these guards that were near the hatch covers that were hit by those covers, and they were just blown apart, just in a mess, all on the deck. One guy ran up to me and he says, I can't swim. You know what I thought? The Boy Scouts, that's where I learned to swim. And if you can't swim, it's over. And way offshore, I could see land. And I thought, well, I can't swim it. I'm not strong enough. But then I could see debris coming around the side of the ship, so I jumped overboard. And here were all these Japanese soldiers shooting the Americans, throwing hand grenades, throwing hand grenades in the hold. It was just chaos. So anyhow, I got in the water and got a hold of this two-by-fours, and there was enlisted men that was trying to hold on with me, and then he was shot. And I couldn't pull him, I couldn't do anything, so I had to use my foot and push him off and scissor kick my way away. And then I got to out some distance from the ship, and it just went up on end like you've seen in the movies, and down it went. And there were 3 planes that were flying around dropping depth charges trying to hit that submarine. So anyhow, the tide was coming in, and then there was a vessel in this convoy of 8 ships that was hit, and it beached itself. And then they began firing at the prisoners escaping. And they'd also let down a lifeboat, and they picked up prisoners and took them back to that beach vessel and shot them off the end of the vessel. Well, anyhow, I picked up a Major Fisher, and we scissor kicked into shore, and I heard this hissing sound, and there were Filipinos that were hidden in the underbrush. So we dashed into the underbrush, and bullets were coming over our heads, and dashed up and through the underbrush and up to a path, and began to make our way along to following the Filipinos. And they had raw eggs and bananas and a little rice for us to eat, and we made our way into a neat shack where there was a French Catholic missionary there, and he gave us a little bit of food, and then we went with the sergeant of the guerrillas over to his shack and decided what to do. And then the men began to come in. I mean, there was one guy, Hayes Blytho, he had a broken jaw, several broken ribs, a saber wound, and a couple bullet wounds. We had to get a little bed and carry him. Filipinos carried him into the inland. And others, they brought in carabao, and other wounded were rode on the carabao, and we went inland and established a little base camp and began picking up survivors all that day. And I was made adjutant of our little survivor group, and was asked by Major Fisher to write up our story of what happened. And that was communicated to General MacArthur's headquarters at Hollandia, that we had so many wounded, we just had to have help. So I would say after about 3 weeks, the Narwhal, the submarine Narwhal, one of our largest submarines, was sent in. And at night, they would build big bonfires to indicate where we were. And after the 3rd night, the Narwhal came in, and these big sailors they looked mammoth to us. We were nothing but skin and bones, but they took all 83 of us down to there was a Colonel McGee who joined our group. One man died on shore, so a total of 83 came out on the narwhal.
At what point did you think, I'm really free, I'm safe?
At the point where we swam to shore and got in with the Filipino guerrillas, and that was the most marvelous feeling I'll ever have in my life, to be free. Of course, we were in bad shape, but that didn't make any difference. We were friends, and I'll never forget that.
How many prisoners were lost on the ship during the sinking?
And there were 667 that lost their lives on that ship, either from bullet wounds or hand grenades or from simply going down with the ship.
And a lot of those guys shot weren't so much trying to escape as they were trying not to drown.
That's right, definitely.
You were the man who had to write up the list of the losses, weren't you?
Yes, I was made the adjutant. So while we were on the submarine, I went around all the men, and we lived in bays with about 20 men to a bay, and you knew everybody by name in your bay. And so I was able to collect the names of all of those that were lost. Amazing.
Tell us about the medical consequences of those over 2 years you spent in camps. What medical problems did you have by the time you were finally in a U.S. Army hospital?
Well, I suppose everybody had amoebic dysentery. At least I had that. We had schistosomiasis, which is a liver fluke that you get when you work in the rice fields. And it eventually works its way into the intestines and can be fatal. And I mentioned the malaria, beriberi, pellagra. These are all dietary diseases. And I think it's fair to say that some men were in shock, and some men had trouble adjusting back to life in the United States. One man committed suicide.
How long were you in hospital?
I think at 42nd General Hospital, they were there for a couple of weeks, and then went on the Monterey back to San Francisco, and then Dale and Swartz and myself flew to Washington, where we met General Marshall, who wanted to know all about what had happened. And before we left him, he apologized for not being able to send help to us, which I thought was very big of him. And Secretary of War Simpson was with him during the interview. And I gave a lot of my information to the casualty branch. All those listed people that had died, I turned into the casualty branch. And Swartz and Dale, being Air Force men and working on that Japanese airfield, they were able to draw plans of the field, which later were supposedly helpful to our armed forces as they came into Mindanao.
John, what was the date when you were free?
September the 7th, 1944, a day I will never forget. Well, it was a day of great exhilaration. It's an emotion that's hard to describe, but after all the terrible fighting that went on in Bataan, and then that awful O'Donnell, and then the Command Tawan wasn't much better. The Val Penal Colony was livable until the escape, and then the time over on at the Sang Work Colony, were trying to help the combat forces of the Japanese, was just very painful, and so it was a tough experience, and now it's all over. We're free. I will say that after I'd escaped, my heart just was breaking for the men that didn't make it. I just felt so badly that wonderful men who were just as dedicated to the country as I was, that it's just bad luck, maybe lack of perseverance, or I don't know. But for some reason or other, they didn't come through, and it just hurts to think of a wonderful fellows that I knew and friends that I'd made that couldn't survive. And that always is a burden that I'll carry till I die.
A lot of veterans talk about feeling guilty that they lived.
Well, I don't know that I don't think I feel guilty about it. A lot of it is just plain luck, and it's a mixture of luck and perseverance. There are men that literally gave up. There were men that did something foolish, like John Stymowski, or not John Stymowski, his name slips my mind. Anyhow, the fellow that stole some clippers from the Japanese, he did it wrong. I mean, he got himself into trouble. I don't blame him for it, but still, it's a mixed bag of feelings, of gratitude and a love of life and appreciation that you're still alive, and yet there's this pathos over outstanding fellows that, had just as much guts and drive and humanness as I do, but didn't. And, I think of a lot of these guys who had much better physiques than I have. I was sort of a skinny guy and not terribly strong, but kept going and made it. But you get on these prison ships, boy, you're just trapped. It's bad deal. There was one ship that had 1,800 men aboard, and only 8 survived. 5 of them got on a floating lifeboat and made their way to the coast of China, and the other 3 were picked up by a Japanese destroyer and taken in Japanese prison camps. Whatever happened to those guys, I don't know. But I mean, these prison ships were bad, and I think there are over something like 5,000 to 6,000 Americans that were lost their lives on the prison ships.
Were you able to stay in touch with any of your fellow prisoners after the war?
Yes, I have some very fine friends that I keep in touch with, and Bill Miller is one man that went blind with me and was with me with the 88th Field Artillery Battalion that I've tried to keep up with.
Did he go blind during the war?
During the war. A number of men lost their eyesight through lack of vitamins.
Right. Malnutrition and various diseases. That's right. When you got back to San Francisco eventually,
Mm-hmm.
you get back to the U.S., you had left a sister and a brother who I think also enlisted.
That's right.
Later on. Your mother and father. You had left a fiance, Pat
Yeah.
Taylor, when you had gone off to war.
Yeah.
Did they have any idea where you had been all this time?
Well, we were able to send out 4 postcards from the Duval Penal Colony with a very brief, practically 1-sentence message to your family. And I have those postcards there in this booklet here I have of clippings and so on. Yeah. But in terms of the men, I was just flooded with letters after I got back from family and friends and fiancés asking if I knew where so-and-so was. And I tried to answer them by by personal response. And that came as a heavy burden when I got out. And I tried to do that and write this story. Now, the reason why that story is so firsthand is because when we were assigned to write the story for Kyers Magazine, We Lived to Tell, my father gave me his secretary. And for about 2 months, I did nothing but dictate to her my story. And that's why it comes out so firsthand, because when I wanted to write the book, I went back to all those typed pages, and there I had it. Of course, I made a few corrections here and there and so on, but it's as if I escaped yesterday and I told the account.
The deluge of letters asking, or people calling, sending letters asking for information about their loved ones and friends. Did that follow the Collier's Magazine article?
Not necessarily. I think there were some that came from that, but others just came from newspaper articles about the sinking of the ship, and you know, and people that have relatives had relatives in the war passed news on to other people and so on. Right. So that
Collier's Magazine, of course, was published here in Springfield.
Yes, it was.
For many, many years until the operation closed down. I think it was 1956.
Uh-huh.
How did you and two of your colleagues, two other officers, get involved in writing that article?
When we got to Washington, the other two officers were in the Air Force, and I was field artillery. We were taken to General Hap Arnold's office for an interview with him, and of course he wanted to know all about what had happened. And then towards the end of the interview, he called in two ghostwriters, Corey Ford and Alistair McBain, and they began to question us. And then General Arnold said he'd like to have this story published. So we were taken to another office with just McBain and Ford, and they suggested that we go home and write down all that we could remember about our experience, which I did do.
What was it like dictating the story to this? This was a woman?
A woman.
Was that good for you? Was it cathartic? Was it therapeutic?
It was, I think it was somewhat painful. Or I will just say it was painful. I don't enjoy talking about it, really. And for years I didn't talk about it. Now everybody wants to hear what happened. So it's from one Rotary Club to another and one church group to another. People want me to talk about it. And I finally decided that, except for a situation like this, I'm not going to talk about it anymore.
You went on to what I think can only be described as a distinguished career in the ministry. You finished your seminary training. Mm-hmm. You did get to China. You were a missionary in China in the years right before the Chinese Revolution. You know how to pick them, don't you, John?
I mean, sure do. Exactly.
And had long ministries after that in Hawaii, in what a small situation. Then you were a cathedral dean, which is not a small position, very important position. And then you also had, from what I gather, a successful pastorate in Bexley, in Columbus, Ohio here, not just down the street from Capital University and Trinity Lutheran Seminary. How did the war change you? Because in some ways, John, it looks like you just sort of went back to 1940 and picked up where you'd left off. And yet, that's hard to imagine.
One of the best things for me was to go back to seminary. I had a focus. A lot of these guys didn't have a focus and got themselves into a lot of trouble. But you know, it was a bit of a shock to come back to the States and walk into a supermarket and I'll see all this cans of food on shelves and everything. You know, it's different. But I had that focus and determination to go out in the mission field. And I really didn't have a clear understanding of what was going on in China. I don't say it in an embarrassed way. I had a lot of idealism about that. But I rather think if the truth were really out in front of us, the overseas department made a mistake in ever sending me out, because things were a mess in China when I got there.
When you titled your book, your memoir, you called it Soldier, Priest, and Adventure in Faith. Now, a lot of folks would look back on the war years and say, well, he was certainly a soldier, he'd been a seminarian, but this is a contradiction, they would say.
Yeah.
You spent most of your life as a priest. Much of what you did in the camps was the work of a priest. You were not ordained. But how do you, to a generation that doesn't understand what World War II is like, how do you explain to young people what it's been like for you to be both soldier and priest?
Well, my concept of the dichotomy, or whatever you want to call it, is simply that if there's a war and you're trying to defend your country, and you have the situation we have going now in Afghanistan, brought about by the bombing of the Trade Center in New York, you've got to get out and defend your cause. And I'm not a pacifist. I think knowing Klaus Friedberg, the German roommate in Ohio State, had quite an influence on my thinking. And later on, as I heard what Hitler did to 6 million Jews, there are times when you have to fight it out with an enemy, and I still feel that way. Now, the war is terrible, and nobody wants to do it, nobody wants to fight. But on the other hand, there are times when you've got to get your back up and defend your cause, whatever it may be. It's that simple. It's not a complicated thing. At seminary, I disagreed with Angus Dunn. It was not Angus Dunn, but Bishop Lawrence, who was a pacifist. And in our theological class, he was presenting the position of a pacifist. And this was when I was a middler in my second year in seminary. And after he finished his talk about pacifism, I had to speak up. And I said, Bishop Lawrence, I just can't buy in on what you're saying. Look what the Germans are doing in Europe and the Italians. They're running over all these free countries. I said, you've got to stop that. So I just held my ground. I felt a little embarrassed because here I was a seminary student disagreeing with a prominent bishop of the church, but I did.
Near the end of the war, it was a few months before the war ended in Europe and half a year before it ended in Asia. A friend of yours wrote a letter to Bishop Hobson, and you included the letter in your book.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to remind you of a passage from that and ask you to tell us a little bit about it to close. I thought it was a very moving letter. He clearly was very fond of you. And this is what he said. He's talking about you. He's telling Bishop Hobson about Captain John J. Morrett. And he's paid you lots of compliments about your sermons. And then he says, at Christmas 1943, he organized, this is in the prison camp now, he organized a midnight candle service, which was the most beautiful service I ever attended. I'm sure no rector ever had a more temperamental bunch of personalities to work with, but he finally assembled and trained a creditable choir. How he ever managed to beg, borrow, or steal enough candles for the service, I'll never know, but he planned and worked on that service for weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what you did that Christmas in 1943? You're not an ordained priest.
Yeah, well, I went to the Japanese and I asked them for candles, and they gave them to me. Surprised that they would, but they did. And by that time, I had a little congregation developed that I think became very loyal to me. And they helped with all the decorating and were very, very supportive. And I think religion became a very, very important thing to prisoners of war. I mean, you got to believe in something more than what you're experiencing. You got to believe in a God that really cares. And to preach a sermon to these prisoners, boy, you've got to be in reality, And Bishop Chapman Howden's Bible helped me quite a bit with that, and I read through the whole Bible while I was in prison camp. I think I don't remember that service being so great as Blakely said it, frankly, but he thought it was a good service, so that's okay.
Well, in the middle of a war, thousands and thousands of miles away from home, you brought those guys Christmas.
Well, I think that's true. The real Christmas. Yeah.
John, thanks for doing this.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. It's a long story, but it was hard to cut parts of it out. So thank you for coming tonight and to the Heritage Museum, to Natalie and to Paul for letting me add my thoughts about your Springfield native. I want to leave you with a final cap, so necessary after this dramatic episode in his life. By the grace of God, he was saved after a harrowing end of this dismal surrender to the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. There were 82 swimmers and 82 miracles that came home aboard the submarine USS Norwal. They were safe at last. In closing, let me tell you, not only did Dad survive, but lived out a long, successful career as an Episcopal clergyman. He never lost his sense of being both a soldier and a priest. It certainly strengthened his 2 sojourns as a missionary in China and then later in Thailand. It shored him up as a pastor in 6 parishes over his career. It gave him administrative prowess as a diocesan dean in Honolulu, Hawaii, and a visionary perspective as church and civic leader wherever he was. He also followed the military avidly through his life and was so proud of his children that entered the military, 1 Air Force and 1 Army. His whole life was challenged but well lived, standing up for that hard right with military and Christian morals and strength. Forgiveness played a major role as well, and I would say he let go of any resentment after the war. And we lived in Hawaii, so and he was a priest there, that was important. On our family front, Dad was introduced to Elnora Day by another Philippine survivor, Dick Cook, in Los Angeles. It was love at first sight, and he married our beautiful mother in June of 1945. He then finished seminary and embarked on a mistimed and perhaps misguided effort, as he spoke about. Dad, Mother, and Sandy Scott were pushed out 2 years later due to the Communist Revolution in 1949. Remarkably, they surfaced in Honolulu only to be assigned to build a new parish there. My brother Dan and I were both born in the 1950s. And it was a blessed turn of events for the couple, beginning 21 marvelous years in this tropical paradise, about to become our 50th state. My father built and was the founding pastor of Holy Nativity Church, Aina Haina. And then in 1962 became the dean of St. Andrew's Cathedral in downtown Honolulu. He was beloved, successful, and definitely a visionary. Important to this story at this time came from an extensive trip around the world. And during that trip in Japan, he tracked down that Christian Japanese guard mentioned earlier. Lieutenant Kemper Yuki, who had been so kind in the Davao Penal Colony, Mindanao. As he told in the video, Yuki would lose his post as commander of the American prisoners when a group of men tried to escape. Remarkably, Lieutenant Yuki forgave the men, knowing how harsh the circumstances were. Dad never forgot this kindness. Now in Japan, 20 years after the end of the war, Dad searched him out and they met again. What ensued was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. They sealed it in a traditional tea ceremony in Kemper Yuki's home. The correspondence of the two lasted a lifetime, becoming a cornerstone of Dad's full recovery from the war, and maybe for Yuki as well. We moved from Hawaii to Ohio in 1970, taking a new post at St. Albans Church in Columbus. Tragically, we lost our mother to a sudden aneurysm 3 years later, and the unexpected loss propelled him to take time off and travel. Subsequently, he met another beautiful woman, Joan Lyle Germanson from Columbus. They married in 1974, and their daughter, Krista Germanson, joined our family at that time. Krista and I were bridesmaids in their wedding. Joni walked gracefully in her new role as a clergy wife and would ultimately serve overseas with him in missionary work on the border of Thailand and Burma. Ultimately, they returned to his beloved Hawaiian Islands to build a home on the Big Island, and he would write his book there. Throughout his life, there were challenges, tragedies, and a call to accept that unacceptable, as he often said. Yet perhaps from his war survival, he had the resilience to overcome those again and again. In conclusion, this resilience is a huge element that makes his story remarkable. I think he had a special drive to live more fully in honor of those fellow soldiers who did not make it home. Losing so many friends who fought to stay alive in those camps was a deep sorrow right to the end of his life. In a VA hospital, October 24, 2011, at 95, he stepped over quietly, having given his life to his Lord, his country, and his family. He said to me once, and I quote, "I've lived a sweet life in spite of the turmoil, rantings, and ravings. I've always had an inner peace, an inner sense of the presence of God. For me, it has been the person of Christ and the persona he expresses. I've always loved that stained glass window at Christ Church, Springfield. I have a picture of that window, and it represents this." So there you are. Here I close. This opportunity to speak has given me a meaningful dialogue with my father. My desire now is that this soldier priest story inspires resilience in your own lives. If this one life can inspire you, the storytelling will serve a greater good. Reverend John Morrett, and Second Lieutenant in the United States Army, World War II Philippines, one of Springfield's finest, speaks to us all. Thank you for listening. Thank you again for the museum and the opportunity to bring Dad home. His ashes were spread in Hawaii, in Thailand, and here in Springfield, where I know he rests in peace. I leave you with these photos of the Springfield family, many of whom are here tonight. A huge shout out to all of them for suiting up and showing up to hear all about their uncle or great uncle. You honor him and me with your effort, and just goes to show how Springfield rolls. I love you all. Thank you so much for tonight.